So
Yeah.
my name is Eduardo. Well, I think there is a big delay, but it should be fine. My name is Eduardo. I'm the maintainer of ViewRouter. And I wrote the last version of ViewRouter, the ViewRouter 4, and I have been maintaining the version for View 2 for some time now, like 3 years or 4 years. And so you can find me online as Posva. I live in Paris. I'm from Spain, and very excited to do a small talk. Not a big one. I wish, I hope I can do one in China someday. But today, one online is good enough. And so for the time being, I've been working on the router. I've been able to see different ways of doing how things are organized. I've been able to reorganize things. And I've come down to this version of the router where we have the URL that communicates with the history, which is not the HTML5 history, but a version that we're building ourselves that communicates with the router instance that then gives us access via Vue to all the functionalities. But we also have something called matcher, and of course we also have the components that you might know. So the router view and the router link. And these two things, the router and the components, are the only two pieces we really get access to, the only two we really interact with in a Vue application. But in reality, we have a few other things that are concentrated in what we call a matcher and a history. And so my goal today is to talk a little bit about what's inside ViewRouter 4. So that's going to be a lot about the new features that some of you might have used and others not, and also some of the technical choices behind them, or how and why they are made that way. So one of the main concepts, one of the main ideas of ViewRouter 4 is to still keep a very, very small
Hi. Hi,
yeah.
Paswa. I can see 2 slides of the.
Oh, let me change.
Yeah.
Sure. There we go.
Cool.
Wait, I'm recording the right one again. Doesn't matter. Yeah, I was sharing the wrong screen. I'm sorry. Thank you for that. I'm not used to this software. So I was saying, yeah, you were just looking at the next one. I was saying that the one of the main ideas of the rewrite for Vue 3 was to still keep an API as similar as possible as the previous one, while improving some of the things that were not working well, like having all the modes into ViewRouter, so you always get the abstract, the memory history, the hash history, and the normal history, no matter what you use. And so on ViewRouter 4, for some users, the only change they need to do is changing how they build the router and how they give it to you. So in ViewRouter 4, instead of having just one import from ViewRouter, we have tree shaking. So we have name exports, and we use them on need, on demand, and that allows us to give a way smaller build for ViewRouter. And also when it comes to the router creation, we still keep the same options that we had before. So that's the create router that we have there with the history, which is replacing mode, and then the routes array is pretty much the same. And so thanks to these, we have a tree shakeable version, and we can have custom history implementations instead of just having 3 limited options that we are giving through a string. Now, when it comes to the routes array, there are not many changes. The main change is how the star route has disappeared, and now it's a custom regex with a repeated param, like 0 or more. That's the parentheses that you can see, the dot star, and then the extra star at the end. Now, the reason for this is because we don't use path to regex anymore. So we use a custom version of parsing, and we generate the routes, or rather the regex ourselves. So no, not only this makes the router much more lighter, but we have a much more precise control of how we build these paths and what information we can attach to them. So for instance, on ViewRouter 4, the order of the routes doesn't matter anymore. So it's still an array, but you can pass them any way you want. They will always work, which wasn't the case before. And we still have the options that we were using before on path to regex, like strict and sensitive. And I want you to give you an overlook of what and where is this exactly on the router architecture. So this is the matcher of the router. It's not inside of the router, it's really a part that is completely separate, that can be used without the router itself, and it's pretty cool. So what it does is transforming every single string, so everything you pass to path in the routes array, it's able to transform it to a regular expression, as you can see on the right. Now, there is no need to dive into the regular expressions, but here we have a /home page, we have a /movies, and then colon ID, which is a dynamic param, so you can match anything. And then we have a movies with an ID that can only be numbers using a custom regular expression. Now, the problem with this approach is that when we add a new route, because they have an order, the matcher is going to test them in that order. So if we add a route that is movies/new, which only matches the new word after movies, when we try to match a URL, for example, movies/news, it's going to try them in order. So as soon as it gets to the second one, it's going to stop there and say, okay, this one works. I can just give to the ID the string new and stop there. But in reality, what we want to do is to match the last one. So this is a bit confusing when we are using the router for the first time and we don't know that the order matters. Now in ViewRouter 4, what we do is that we're able to associate a score to all the routes because we are building them. We parse the path and we are able to give a score to each path and say which one is more important than the others. So using these scores, we can order them ourselves in a way that the more precise, the more strict paths are always in the beginning on the array. So that way, when we test them, we are testing them in a way that works for the user all the time. Now, the way this works is by taking every single section of the path, so everything that is in between the slashes, and we assign a score. So for example, home, because it's only a string home, it can only match home, it has a score of 70. Then on the other hand, movie is new because it has 2 segments, because it has 2 slashes, it's 70 plus 70. And then if we go into movies ID, the ID, because it's a dynamic param, has a lower score, so we have to sum up 70 and 60. And then the one with the custom regular expression has a bonus of 5 points because it's a custom regular expression. So it can match a limited amount of things. Now, in reality, this is the simplified version. This is the version that Reach Router, for example, was using with smaller numbers, more or less, because they don't support regular expressions and they only support very, very basic path matching. But ViewRouter is way more advanced. So what I have here is this tool that I build using the router here. So it's using the matcher of the router, basically. It doesn't have the ViewRouter itself. And you can test routes here. They will appear on the right, and you can test them with anything you want, and they will appear all the matches. And here, one of the things that is important to note when it comes to ViewRouter is that we can handle subpaths. So we can, like sub-segments, more to say. We can do something like that. Then some static here, and then page 3. And as you can see here, we don't have just one score, we have 5 scores because we have one for each sub-segment. So inside of one slash, we have more things, and then we can have another things, something like static or something like that. And then this route is going to match very complex things like second thing, then we have the static, then we have the third, and then we have static. And then it matches, and then we can have all these things. And we can have also the custom regular expression. So if I say here, I want a number, then it's not going to match anymore unless I change these with numbers, and then it matches again. So being able to handle all these of sub-segments and multiple segments and everything is what makes the matcher of the router very powerful and allows us to keep an API that used to work with path to regex without removing features like having simplified dynamic params. Like it would be a pain if we could only do these, or like only have dynamic or static path, segments in the path. That would be a pain, and it would not be compatible with the previous version. But what we have is something a bit more complex that works in many cases. Okay, where did my slides disappear? There we go. So behind the scenes, the matcher is way more complex than it looks like, and it's completely separated from the router. And it might look like it's not a big deal, like it's not something important, but it's what enables the router to have dynamic routing, which itself is not that important. But the good thing is that we are able to get these for free, right? We're able to have this dynamic routing because we have a matcher that is smart enough and is able to properly order the routes the way we want. If you want to know more about the dynamic routing, it went through an RFC, like pretty much all of the features that I'm showing now. And you can give it a look and see the full API and how the reasoning behind it. Also, it's important to know that there is a similar API for View Router 3, but it has caveats. It doesn't work all the time because we don't have that ordering. So you cannot just add routes and expect them to work. Okay, so that's the matcher section of the route. And I want to talk a bit more about the router right now. Now, the router does a lot of things, and I'm not going to dive into the proper splitting of how the router could be split, because I haven't really done it inside of the code base anyway. So even if you want to go there and check it, you won't see it. The router in the View Router code base is the biggest file of the repository. And it contains more than it should, but still without being problematic, because we're not exporting the other functionalities by themselves. So one of the things that the router does is transforming the URL, splitting them up into multiple things and extracting this object version of the location that we're able to use. And there is a few things interesting to note in the object that we have. For example, the query, the hash, the params are usually unencoded. So we get the row values. You can see how in the URL we have the 20% which, and then we have query, queue, then we have the which with a space, which is the row version of the 20%. Now, most of you probably know that the URL is split in three things. We have the search, the query, and the hash. And all these three things have been accessed through a location object, which is accessible as a global property on the document, on window. And the thing is, we can, and sometimes we write URLs without thinking about the encoding of the URL. And this makes sense because for an end user, you cannot expect them to know that they need to write a %20, right? So they don't know that in reality, you should write these because they don't know anything about URL encoding. And this is even more true for languages that are fully Unicode based, like Chinese, for example, Japanese, Korean. But in any case, even in English, they also use characters that are not part of ASCII anyway. So you cannot expect the user to know these things. And the user is going to write just a regular space or the character they want. And some browsers are going to treat these differently. So this is why URL encoding is a big part that sometimes goes unnoticed, but there is a big work behind it. So in its most basic form, we just take a character. We have the numeral representation, and then we use an encoded version, which is based on the percentage character. So for instance, if we want to write on the URL anywhere, doesn't matter where, these tag with a P, with a class A, we have to write something like this, which is not readable at all. The reality is that we don't have that many rules when it comes to URL encoding. So if we check the spec, we're going to see that we have these rules that says anything that is non-printable has to be encoded. Anything that is non-ASCII, so beyond the TL character, the small wave, has to be encoded. Then we have the percentage character itself, which of course needs to be encoded because it's used for encoding. Sorry. And then what is funny is that we have different set of rules for the path, the query, and the hash. So the hash has requires you to encode the space, the double quote, the lower than, bigger than, and the backtick. Sorry, I have to wait. Let me just mute myself for a second. Can't. I don't know. Okay. So the path is going to take all these characters and it's going to add on top of that the hash character because it's used for the hash, the interrogation mark because it's used for the query, and then the curly braces, which were supposed to maybe be used by the query, but at the end we don't have, well, they are not used in the HTTP protocol at least. Now the query, you take everything from the hash, but you remove the backtick and you add the hash because it's used by the hash, later on the URL, the ampersand, and then the equal character because they are used inside of the query. So this is the theory, right? This is what should be done by the browsers. Now, what happens in practice? In practice, if you set via the JavaScript console the location.hash to this small string, you're going to see very different behaviors. So if you do it on Safari, and then you read again from the location.hash, you're going to see the exact same value. Okay, you don't see any changes, which it's a bit problematic because you expect as a developer to get the encoded version, which is the version that matches the spec, but that's not the case. Then the funny thing is, if you look at the URL, you're going to see a %20 instead of the space. So this is weird because the user is going to get the encoded version while the developer doesn't, which doesn't make any sense. On Firefox, you're going to see that the hash becomes the encoded version, which is perfect because that's the version that you should get. And what is more interesting is that they're going to display an unencoded version on the URL. So the end user, which doesn't know anything about encoding, is going to see a normal version, something that they can read. On Chrome, we also get the encoded version, which is great. But on the URL, we get something that is partially unencoded. So it's okay. It's not as good as Firefox, but it's still great. And Internet Explorer doesn't care. It just takes the whole thing, it puts it there, it puts in the variable, in the URL, it doesn't care. Now, I know we don't care anymore about Internet Explorer because we dropped support for IE11 on Vue 3, but when I was building the Vue router, we were not sure yet about that. So I wrote the whole code base, the whole code base, mostly the encoding and some of the browser quirks, specific things, knowing that maybe I had to support Internet Explorer in the future. Now, let's do another experiment, and is setting the location hash to the encoded version of that same string, so the valid version. And now if we take a look at Safari, we get the encoded version as well, which is great. That's the exact same string we set. The URL, it's encoded, which is a bit surprising because it means that we have the space encoded, but we get different hashes, which is weird. Firefox is going to get you the same behavior as before, which is great because it means that it protects the developer, and also that no matter where the change comes from, since the user can also modify the URL themselves by writing on the address bar, it gives you the unencoded version as a user, but the encoded version as a developer, which is perfect. From also gives you the same result as before. So it's the same. It's not as good as Firefox, but at least it's consistent. So that's great. And Internet Explorer doesn't care. So just take this whole thing. It doesn't really matter. So Safari has a questionable behavior. Firefox is the best behavior you could have because it means that the user really gets something that is readable and the developer something that is valid. Chrome is great because at least we have the same results. It's consistent. And Internet Explorer just gave up, but we know that already. That's why it's not a browser anymore, right? So it would be great if in the router we only had to handle these cases, but that's not the case, right? Because these are consistent in both scenarios, but the others are not. So in the router, we try to handle them in a more, how to say, we let some errors happen and we fall back to the values that are given by the user just to make sure. So what I want you to remember about this is that you should avoid writing paths that are not encoded. Instead, you either write the encoded version yourself, which is very annoying, or you use names with routes, and you can pass unencoded versions in the params, but never pass the non-encoded version as a push, because no matter what router you use, so ViewRouter 4 handles this much better than ViewRouter 3, but you may still end up with inconsistencies when it comes to the browser dealing with that section of the URL. They may give you something that you never expect to happen. So this is okay, and this is the best version. And also, if you use the query, you can also pass directly anything that is not encoded because it will be handled. And if you want to know more about this, which is maybe not that interesting, but for some people might be, I wrote about it in this encoding.ts file in the ViewRouter Next repository. It's mostly comments, mostly all of my notes I took while I was investigating the issues. And it has a little bit of code, but it's a lot of comments everywhere. Okay, moving to a different topic. Let's talk about active links. Active links have changed between ViewRouter 3 and 4. And the change comes from an internal improvement that didn't exist in ViewRouter 3. So active links is just the fact that when you write a router link somewhere, then it gets rendered as a tag, and it gets a class depending on the current URL to say, hey, this route is active, as if we were visiting something like a nested child of that route. The problem is that, as you can see on the screen, the home page by default is always going to be active because it's on the slash. So anything is, it includes the slash. And then we have the other routes like users24 post, which has a router link active and a router link exact active. Now, if we put this into a table and we put different cases, so we have the slash, we have the name version with home, and then we have users24, 24 profile, 24 post. The only one that gets the both classes is user24 post. But the problem with the home is that it's active, and users24 should be active as well, but that works. So the thing we did in ViewRouter 3 is introduce this exact prop. Now, the problem with the exact prop is that it removes pretty much everything. So the users24 doesn't work anymore. So we have to selectively apply that prop in different places. And it was more like an escape for specifically the home URL only. So what we do, and also the problem is that if you add anything else to the URL, like a hash, a query, then even the same route, like the users24 post at the end that was active before, is not going to be active anymore. So that's a problem, right? In ViewRouter 4, what we do is we remove that prop completely. So the way we handle this is we take into account the route records themselves. So the way they were added by the developer, we are able to trace back, even with aliases, and it doesn't matter, we're able to trace back how, what is the record that represents a location. And then we're able to see if there are children or not, and if they are the same route record. So that way there is no need for exact anymore. It just works out of the box. And also we only take care about the path, because at the beginning, that's, because in most scenarios, that's what we want to take care about. We don't care about the hash or the query to be a part of the URL to make them active. And it's still possible to add that behavior on our own if we want to. Now, the whole thing can be found on Active Links RFC. This one is interesting because it has a lot of of tables with all the possible examples. So it can be interesting to take a look. Now, there is another thing that changed, and I tried to backport to ViewRouter 3. So some of you might have seen this problem, is when you use a router push instead of a router link and you're pushing somewhere, if you happen to push twice to the same location, you will get this error in the console as if you were doing something that was not supposed to happen, but that's not the case. Now, the origin of this problem is the route-to-the-push with the callbacks uncompleted and unabort. And at some point in the history of ViewRouter 3, we added an API that if no uncomplete or unabort callbacks were passed to the push, we would return a promise. But the promise was basically the same as resolving for incomplete and rejecting for unabort, which ends up on this uncoding promise. So if you don't do a catch on the router push, then any unabort will end up on rejecting the promise, which is a problem. So I realized that nobody was using, or people were not really using these as much because most of the people didn't realize, and there was a big noise in the issues of ViewRouter. So the thing is, also the other problem is that uncomplete is, there is a global equivalent for it. It's the router after each. But unabort, which is when you call next false, or like somewhere in a guard, navigation guard, you decide to drop the navigation, there is no global equivalent. There is no way to attach globally to that. So there was a problem. There was an inconsistency there that we couldn't solve on the version of ViewRouter 3. So on ViewRouter 4, what we do is that we merge both uncomplete and unabort on a failure. So this failure is what you call the navigation failure. And it's not a promise rejection anymore. So you get access to that failure in the then of the promise. Now that failure can be undefined or null, and in that case it means that the navigation did end up happening. But if there is one, it means the navigation didn't happen at the end. Now, the good thing is that you get access to this thing globally in the router after each. And the good thing is that you still can catch errors. So for example, if you have a JavaScript error in a navigation guard, or you throw an error somewhere, you're going to still get an error on the promise, because that's an unexpected error that you should fix. So if you add a catch on the router push, then you can get that on the error on the router. That also exists on ViewRouter 3, but it doesn't handle the navigation failures the same way. And also, if you need to have a very precise check of the failures, you can use the isNavigation failure and the navigation failure type to check for different kind of navigations. So that's useful. There are 3 kinds of navigations, by the way. You have the cancel. So this is when you call next false in a navigation guard. Aborted is when a navigation is ongoing, but there is a new one that happens and it's going to abort the previous one. And duplicated is when you navigate to the same location twice. The router is not going to navigate there, because that will be pushing a new URL and having two times the same URL in the history. So meaning that if you go back, it's going to stay on the same page. Now, the whole thing went through an RFC. This one is a bit more elaborated if you want to go read it, but it's interesting to check. And moving into a completely different topic that also big improvement on the new version is the scroll behavior. Now, the scroll behavior itself hasn't changed much. The API is pretty much the same. The only difference is that we're changing the object we return. So instead of having a selector and an offset, we're using L and top. So this is to align more with the scroll to options to show that we support passing the same kind of options to that object, meaning that we can add things like behavior smooth to give just a smooth scrolling, and also know that you can do this in HTML directly. If you do a scroll behavior smooth in CSS and you apply it to HTML, you can get automatic smooth scrolling in modern browsers. But there is something more important to note about the scroll behavior in ViewRouter 4, is that we handle way better the restoration and the saving of the positions. This means that there are so many more cases that are handled, like for example, navigating through a page, going back, scrolling in between, then going forward. All these scenarios, they are handled, which means that by default, without doing anything, on ViewRouter 4, you get sometimes a better scrolling restoration behavior. It's not sometimes, it's you get a better scroll restoration behavior than in native apps. So something that it's made like with normal navigation, using the browser reloading features, right? Like the old way of the applications, non-SPAs. You get better scroll restoration than the one done by the browser. So let me show you a demonstration where I'm gonna click on different places. There is a transition to show also that it works with a transition. I go back, you can see how I go back to the same position. I scroll a little bit, I go forward, and I can see how the same scroll is preserved. And I do it a few more times, and I can see how I still preserve that position in every single transition. And here I do go to number if multiple times, and I can see how I can click on the same link multiple times and it goes to the same place. And then I'm probably going to use the smooth scroll. There we go. And you can see how you get just smooth scroll out of the box. This is just going to add the smooth option to the scroll behavior function in router, which can also be done with the HTML property. And it handles all the things out of the box. And because we have this function scroll behavior, if you're fetching data somewhere, you can also control that. And you can also scroll after the data is fetched, so that if you have, for example, a page that is long and it needs to load all the things that are up here, you're going to scroll after the data is fetched and getting a much better scrolling experience to your users than in non-SPAs pages. The whole thing is inside an RFC if you want to check it. This one is very interesting, but may be worth checking. One other thing that has changed and is a big improvement for the future of ViewRouter 4 is the removal of, it's not the removal because you can still use it, but you don't need anymore to use the next parameter. So instead of writing these, you can just return the direction you want to go. So if you want to redirect, you're going to just return a version, and you don't return anything if you don't want to do anything. So the guards are a bit more straightforward to write, and also it's easier to not mess up. And this works with async. So if you do promises, if you are waiting between, that also works. You don't need to do anything. It just works out of the box. Now, the problem this is fixing is very often, especially when you start using the router, people do not realize that they cannot call next multiple times, and they do not read the docs always. So if you call next multiple times, you're going to have some trouble. And in some situations, it might fail, or they don't call next at all, meaning that the navigation doesn't finish. They don't transition to the new page. So this is the problem, the main problem that we are trying to solve with the returning statement, which makes a little more sense for something that you only need to call once inside of a function. Returning makes more sense. So in ViewRouter 4, you can still use the next version, but you can omit the parameter on the function for navigation guards, and it will work. And probably, I think, maybe in future versions, we only support returning instead of a next callback. But in ViewRouter 4, you can use both. And there is an RFC again, so you can check more about it in the RFC. There is another big feature on ViewRouter 4 that hasn't been backported yet to ViewRouter 3. And it's the route prop on router view. Now, by default, the router view is going to be connected to what is displayed on the address bar. So it means that it's always synchronized to the URL to display the route that is supposed to be displayed by your application. But sometimes you don't want to do that. More specifically, and this is why I'm going to talk about models, is when you want to display models, which is a questionable pattern on itself, but a lot of people do it, and sometimes it makes sense. But what I want to say is that the underlying mechanism behind display models is way more powerful. It's a prop that is applied to router view that allows you to disconnect, to display something else on the page that should not be displayed with the current URL. And so you can do models with some code like this. So you start by having this use route somewhere that you use. Then we create some kind of computed on the history state. So we observe the route full path to see if it changed, and then we retrieve the history state. This is a small hack to give us a reactive version of the history state. And then we have this computer version of the route that will display a model. So we read the history state. We're going to see that we can write to the history state. And we read a URL there, and we use router resolve to get the actual route. And if we have a background view, we're going to resolve that route and return that as the route that we should display. Otherwise, we are going to return the route, which means that we can have a route that is supposed to display something, but we're going to display something else. So let me give you an example. Oh yeah, and at the end, you have to pass that to the router view with a prop. So let me give you an example with that demo, which is a bit fast. In this application, let me just pause. In this application, what I have is multiple users. And when I click on any of the users, I can see how the URL changes, and I can see the page of the user. So here I'm going through a few, I'm going back and forward, and then I'm showing how I click the details button. And I can see that I stay on the same page. I have this model with the user, but the URL is, if you notice, changes. Here it's model, and when I go here, it's model/users1, which was the same as previously when I was here. There you go. /user/something. But we're not displaying this page. We're displaying the same page we are on with the model. And here I go, I think I close it. Yeah, I display maybe another one. I can see how it stays in the history. And if I go back, I just restore it without any trouble. So here I go to somewhere else, and then I go back again, and I can see how it restores the model and the URL, but displays the correct view I want. And the good thing is that this is persisted even when we reload the page. When we reload the page, you're going to see that I go back. I go too quick. When I go back, I see the same model again. So this is restored all the time. And even if you navigate to another page, you go somewhere else, if you go back, this is going to be in the history state, so it's always going to be there. So this is the router view prop. It hasn't been migrated yet to ViewRouter 3, but probably go somewhere in the future. Okay, and then we have the other things that you might have used. I mean, you probably have used if you use the ViewRouter 4 that are not migrated to ViewRouter 3 because there is no composition API out of the box on View 2. So we have use router, use route, and then we have some navigation guards. We have on before route update, on before route leave, and we have the use link as well. So use router and use route are the equivalent of $route and $router, which still exist in ViewRouter 4. In the template, you still have access to these variables. You still have access in component methods and computed. You can still use these $route and router. So this is pretty much straightforward. It's just the equivalent. Something interesting are the navigation guards. We now have on before route leave and on before route update inside of setup, so that's cool. And you can do the same because there are navigation guards. You can omit the two. You can use the next parameter if you want, but you have that flexibility. And then you have the use link, which I don't think a lot of people use, but it gives you pretty much the API that is used by a router link without having a component. That's pretty much it. Also, I'm not going to dive much in the DevTools, but there is a huge improvement in the DevTools because Guillaume, Acrium, made a lot of changes on the beta for the DevTools, and the view router and UX and any other library can add their own inspectors and data to components. So now we have a much more detailed route. How do you call this? A book of routes. Like you can check all the routes, you can test them and everything. You can see the scores, you can see on the right here. So very, very advanced features, very cool. If you haven't used yet, you should definitely give it a try. And because it's removed in production, we can even add features that make them make the whole DevTools experience very, very nice without impacting on the final bundle. So to put it in a nutshell, on View Router Next, we have dynamic routing, custom history, and we have better encoding defaults, or rather good encoding defaults. We have a composition API, we have better navigation guides, we have better TypeScript support as well. We have some upcoming features like having TypeScript support for params, being able to specify what are the params you can add when you add the name on a push. So like typed router push, basically. So pickaxe worked on these and there is a pull request open that I have to go through yet. And there are a few things that I want to add, but this is going to be really cool. The code base should be easier to contribute as well. There is a lot of comments in the code base, and the router itself is not always easy because it's a bit, the problem with the routing is that you have to take care about things working in multiple browsers, and it's full of caveats and browser quirks, but at least the code base has more comments and it's split in different sections. And then we have better debugging as well because of the DevTools. I'm also trying to give more per case documentation or end-to-end cases to give people examples of things that they like to do, and it's not that easy to implement. And we cannot provide an out-of-the-box solution on the router because it would be too opinionated and too constraining. So we have to give the user the instructions. For example, models, instead of having an out-of-the-box feature for models, we specify these route prop on the router view because it will be too constraining to do otherwise. And finally, the good thing about the router next is that while the version 3 of the router was about 9 kilobytes, a bit more, the next version, the version 4, is under 6.5. And this is noting that we have more features than the previous version. So we have dynamic routing and everything. We have all the things that we had before and more, and even more things and more bug fixes. And with all these changes, we're still smaller than View Router, which, by the way, a big improvement is like 30%, a bit less in size. And if you want to check out the repository, or probably some of you might have done it already, open issues for bug reports, I'm very active over there. So on the View Router Next repository that you can check. And I just want to say thank you to my sponsors. I'm still looking for sponsors for open source. Trying to do, so I spend most of my time doing open source, but I'm still not profitable. So I still have to do some freelancing on the side to be able to pay for a living, to live. And I'm still looking for sponsors. So if any of you know some companies that are willing to sponsor, know that depending on the kind of sponsors, I put the logos on the router pages, and we have a huge traffic, especially from China, by the way. So that can be interesting for you. Thank you. I hope you learned something, and I will be here for the questions, I think.
Anyone has questions? Thank you for the wonderful talk. Actually, I do collect some questions from the audience. The first one is, how do you get the scores? You know, the scores for router. Like, why do you pick 80, not 10?
Oh, yeah. So I did, it's research, basically, right? So I inspired myself from, I started from Reach Router, and they have a basic version of the scoring, and they explain a strategy. And then what I did, because they only handle a very basic version, is write down the numbers and do some mathematics and see if the numbers I was applying were, I demonstrated basically that the theory should work in the cases. I found a few caveats, but I accept those caveats because people were not going to use it. So let me just see. Next step, default parameters. Is it here? No, here. There we go. So here's the path ranking of rich router, and rich router only handles like dynamic segments or static segments, and they have a basic scoring system that I have. Some of the numbers are similar, like I have 70 for static.
Cool.
And I have, so this is a 6 plus 7, that's 13, and they explain everything here. I mean, they explain a bit of it. So what I did is I inspired myself from this technique to create a score that is non-linear. So they only have one number. And in my version, I have to have multiple numbers per section because I can do sub-sections of the URL. And then I just put down the numbers. And because some of the things are smaller, for example, if you do the street, you can see 0.7. I multiplied the whole score set by 10, so I could have more precise numbers. And then it's just research.
So anyone in the Tencent meeting has questions, so you can just drop the question. Okay, so some audience says there are some breaking changes. They're a little bit worried about the. Do you have opinions on it?
Yeah, so the breaking changes there are only a few breaking changes, and we really try to keep this to the minimal. So there is a whole migration with all the breaking changes, and you can see that the list might look long, but most of the things are very, very, they are edge cases. So most of the people are not gonna see them. So of course, the whole creation is different, like in view 3. So the history is also different, but that doesn't matter because you change everything at the same time. And then we have the base option, which has moved. The star, which is the thing I was explaining, say that now we have to write this instead of a star. We have a few renames. So onReady becomes isReady because we have a promise. And then the biggest one is the fact that it's no longer possible in view 3 to put transition around router view. So we have to use this syntax, which is a lot more complicated, but that's a technical limitation. And it gives us also other improvements when it comes to view 3. It handles a lot of things way easier than in view router 3. So because view 3 handles all the keep alive and transition better than view 2, we don't have to do a few hacks that we had to use in view router 3. In view router 4, the router view component, it is much more straightforward and it doesn't have any hacks because view 3 handles everything very well.
Good.
Then,
so there's another question. Can we use wheel router 4 with wait?
whale router?
Maybe my pronunciation.
Is it? Can I check it on the chat, on WeChat?
Yeah, I can send it to you.
No, I mean, I see it.
Wait.js or wait.js?
Oh, the append?
Can it work well with?
So the append. Wait, I don't see the questions. If it works with Vite, yes, it works with Vite. There should not be anything. It should work out of the box.
Okay. So anyone else have questions? Oh, do you have tips or suggestions for reading the source code of view router?
Let me see. I think that depending on where you want to go, you can go by folder. So you have the matcher and the history, which I was talking about before. And then other things that are just global have their own files. So you have the encoding, errors, you have navigation guides here. So I think that if you do a search on the API you want to learn about, you're going to find in the code base something that is interesting, and then you can go from there. All the types and everything you can use, because it's everything in TypeScript, you can control click or command click on VS Code, and you will move to the places you want. But usually you have a lot more comments also in the code base. So half of the files are comments a lot of the time.
就如果你对某个 API 比较感兴趣，然后 VS Code 的那个 TS 可以直接 click 过去吗？就是可以看它内部实现是怎么样。Okay. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, I think I did has a question before, but I'm not sure is it suitable here. I collect some questions before the
Sure.
before this talk.
Yes.
Like the first one is do you have a best practice for design complicated system?
What was the beginning? I understood the complicated system.
Like, do you have the best practice for complicated system?
Like complicated URLs or?
Yeah. Yeah. The router design.
Oh, the design of the architecture?
Router for.
Oh, no, the routing design.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult. So it's difficult to give something that can apply to everybody. I try to do everything in the documentation, but the problem is two complicated applications are gonna be very different, and the goal of the router is to stay as flexible as possible for different users to still use it correctly. I think that I would recommend general things, but routes, just check the route matching syntax, because sometimes it's useful to know that you want to match only some specific things in the URL and keep it practical. I usually name them as well. So I will do a name based on the URL, something that can be easily inferred from the URL. So for example, /users /ID, I will call that user details or user.id, something like that. I think Next.js, they do a very good job in inferring the names automatically from the path. And I think that's usually something good. Knowing that you have very repeatable params, using the props true on the route, so you can pass the params as props, is also useful. And then the more complicated cases are when you have to mess up name routes and nested routes, but there is no best practice. Like it's complicated
I will tell
already.
the person to read the documentation carefully.
It's not even, there are things you won't be able to find in the documentation. You're gonna find a basic scenario that explain you how things work and give you an example, but then you have to apply everything and for your cases, because there are too many cases for the router to handle that we cannot.
Do we have other questions? Okay. Thank you both for sharing what's inside Beautiful. OK，Postwise 现在在对那个 View Router 网站找那个赞助，所以如果你知道你们公司对开源框架有赞助的话，可以联系我，他也在群里边，然后你直接加他微信联系他也可以。I said some Chinese.
Yeah.
For finding sponsors.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. So we're end.
Okay.
See you.